Hey all, Infernal here. The Sega Genesis, also known as the Megadrive elsewhere in the world, was a formative console for me, one that had established me as a lifelong gamer. Pound for pound, I'd probably hold the Super Nintendo a bit higher, mostly because of the sheer amount of quality JRPGs, but I can't deny the staying power and influence the Genesis had, especially during its 90s heyday. Just a little bit edgier and cooler than Nintendo's offerings, the Genesis has some absolute classics, and in this video, I wanted to talk about 10 that were favorites to me in particular. These may not be a top 10 for the console as a whole, but they're my top 10. And they're the games I remember most fondly, and that also sparked my continued interest in gaming. Before we begin, some of my criteria for this list are that each of the games on it should still be playable and enjoyable today. In other words, I should be able to pop them in and get similar enjoyment out of them that I did as a kid. Also, I'm limiting myself to one game per franchise, which is a challenge, but I think it helps to show a little bit more variety in my choices. And finally, the games I pick should be Genesis exclusives, and not ports that were released on other consoles at the time. So again, just a reminder that this is my personal opinion, and I acknowledge that it may live out some favorites. If a game you love didn't make the cut, it might be because, for whatever reason, I skipped it at the time, and didn't give it the time it deserves, or it just didn't resonate as much with me. Anyway, without further ado, let's do what Nintendo didn't. Coming out very late in the Genesis lifespan, Vectorman was an effort to show that the Genesis still had some graphical tricks up its sleeve to compete with some of the heavy hitters on Super Nintendo. The game uses mostly spheres for character graphics, allowing it to do some really clever perspective and scaling tricks, and it also means it moves at an ultra buttery 60 FPS. Frame rates were a technical novelty, and something I didn't personally care about much in the mid-90s, but I knew that Vectorman felt smooth, and it's as satisfying to play as it is to watch. The run-and-gun platforming is reminiscent of the very best of the genre, Contra, Gunstar Heroes, and I think it can at least stand on the same platform as those kinds of games, if not overtake them. Also, on a console that is usually dunked on for subpar audio, the soundtrack is absolutely incredible. In fact, I think it's a testament to the quality that it still had the first level tune memorized, even after not playing the game for over 20 years. I firmly believe that if Sega had focused on titles like Vectorman, instead of branching off into stuff like the 32X, the Genesis could have stayed a powerhouse for much longer. I was really going back and forth about putting the first Ecco game or the sequel, as I try to stay to my rule of one game per franchise, and overall, I have to give the edge to the Tides of Time. The first Ecco game might have left a more iconic and lasting impression, but I like the gameplay of the second game a bit better. It's balanced a little nicer, especially in the difficulty department. It also retains the weirdness of the first game, with its story focused on time travel and various sci-fi tropes and creatures. It's also a great looking game. As with the first, the devs clearly studied a lot of marine life and environments, and the resulting game has some of the most beautifully detailed pixel art of the era. I recommend trying the first game just to experience it, but I think the second game has more staying power. My personal attachment to Virtua Racing is that it was one of the selections for the Blockbuster World Game Championship when I competed in 1994. No, I didn't win, and I didn't place particularly well either. Using the special SVG chip built into the cartridge itself, the game had tech similar to Star Fox on the Super NES, using simple polygons to create a 3D look. This kind of game is a perfect fit for that kind of polygonal simplicity. It is another example showing that the Genesis was actually capable of more than was originally thought. It's also a really solid racing game to boot, developed by Sega's internal AM2 group, and directed by Sega superstar Yu Suzuki. Sega had an excellent track record, no pun intended, of amazing arcade racing games, and Virtua Racing fits in that pantheon nicely. The Genesis was a treasure trove of quality run-and-gun platformers, and the Shinobi series is no exception. In some ways, it can be seen as Sega's answer to Ninja Gaiden. The third game in the series, Return of the Ninja Master, is my personal favorite, and is the game I feel really perfected the formula, having a good balance of showing off some of the Genesis capabilities and still maintaining a frenetic gameplay experience. The game was easier than previous ones in the series, but I liked the focus on making the game speedier. The various ninjutsu techniques give some gameplay variety, since the player needs to use a fair amount of strategy about when to employ them effectively, especially the self-sacrifice move. Shinobi 3 is an example of a game developed in-house by Sega that shows how great they could be at the top of their game. Streets of Rage remains probably one of the finest beat-em-up series of the entire 16-bit era, and the second game is my personal favorite. I think this game is pretty simple on paper, but few have matched how satisfying it is to unleash combos of waves upon enemies. Having two-player couch co-op set it apart from that other big beat-em-up on the Super NES, Final Fight, that on initial release only supported one player at a time. And man, let's talk about the soundtrack. I've mentioned that the Genesis wasn't exactly known as a sound and music powerhouse, but the Streets of Rage games across the board have excellent soundtrack work by Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima. There's a nice variety of techno, breakbeat, and house music, which to be featured in an early 90s beat-em-up was certainly a move that was well ahead of the curve. It's a soundtrack that can prominently go toe-to-toe with some of the Super NES's best, easily. Sonic the Hedgehog was the game and the mascot that sold me on the Genesis as a kid. I thought he was the perfect counter to Mario, an edgier, cooler, and faster character that brought that sort of energy the Genesis needed, and a character that was enough to pull kids away from the Nintendo at the time. Not only did I subscribe to the comics, I woke up at 6 a.m. on Saturdays to watch the cartoon, so it's safe to say I was won over by the little blue dude. I wanted to put more than one Sonic game on this list, but holding steady to my rules, I'm choosing Sonic and Knuckles. I'm allowing myself to include Sonic 3 with Sonic and Knuckles, because really, the story is intended to be presented as one game. The Sonic and Knuckles cartridge was one of my first ever experiences with a game expansion, and I loved the novelty of plugging in different games into the lock-on slot on the top. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is my favorite Sonic game, not just on the Genesis, but maybe ever, because I love the size of the game, the ability to play through with different characters, and the story told through visual moments rather than text crawls. The 3D Sonic games, for one reason or another, never really clicked for me, but this one remains at the top. The 8 and 16-bit eras were arguably Konami's apex as a developer. The sheer amount of quality titles, both licensed or otherwise, is only rivaled by Capcom at the time. I was lucky enough to find Rocket Knight Adventures as a kid, being intrigued by the mascot on the cover, that was maybe not so subtly trying to cash in on the Sonic craze. Rocket Knight is very much its own thing though, and it's damn good. The thing plays as mostly a run-and-gun platformer, with occasional shmup elements, maybe also drawing from Konami's strengths in games like Gradius and Life Force. The hook is Sparks' Rocket Pack, which can be charged to unleash both an attack and to help him get hard-to-reach areas. Rocket Knight squeezed out some of the absolute best sprites the Genesis had to offer, and the interesting gameplay variety makes it incredibly replayable. It can also be surprisingly hard. Not Contra hard, mind you, but definitely something to keep you on your toes. I recommend Rocket Knight Adventures any day of the week. As I've mentioned before, the Genesis wasn't quite the JRPG powerhouse the Super NES was, but there are nevertheless a few titles that are well worth the time. Any of the Phantasy Star games could fit on this list, but going by my rule, I'm choosing number 4. Even though the first game was arguably the most groundbreaking, 4 has the most quality of life improvements, visual flair, and story that kept me coming back. The storyline even has the epic tale trope of having multiple generations involved, which certainly wasn't a common storytelling device in the 16-bit era. In fact, the story over the initial 4 Phantasy Star games takes place over several millennia, weaving a complex narrative. I really like sci-fi RPGs, and while some titles during the PlayStation era scratched that itch, the 16-bit era was a little more sparse in that department. The Phantasy Star series remains an important RPG series, and I can only hope Sega considers releasing a newer title in the IP. I'm a huge strategy RPG geek, so this one was a no-brainer to put on the list. Even if you're looking to simply dip your feet into the genre, though, Shining Force 2 is a really great entry point, since it's not as complicated as later titles in the genre. The sprites are colorful and the characters are charming as well. and despite a forbidding presence later in the story, it's mostly lighthearted and fun enough to play through. The story is not as complicated as the Phantasy Star games, but it's cohesive, and it also doesn't require that you've played the first Shining Force games to understand it. It can also be pretty fun to explore the mechanics and find ways to effectively break the game, a tradition that continued through subsequent strategy RPGs. Highly recommend Shining Force 2. Alright, and finally, if I could have a favorite Genesis game, this is it. In fact, Gunstar Heroes sits in my top 20 of all time. It's a pretty short game, but one that fires on all cylinders and has no filler. Treasure really delivered for Sega in this era, and showed that they can make an incredibly tight run-and-gun shooter that absolutely crushes in all categories. I love the mechanic of combining two different gun powers to create a new one, and half the fun is experimenting with different combinations. One of the reasons it's so playable is it's also a fantastic co-op shooter game, a genre that becomes increasingly rare in modern times. I also love the soundtrack, which like Vectorman and Streets of Rage, I still get in my head to this day. And, oh, I love the character designs too. And I love the ability to pick your own path. Did I mention it's my favorite Genesis game? Gunstar Heroes is pure genius. So thanks for checking out my personal top 10 Genesis games. These are games I recommend, that I think would be a good start if you recently got into the Genesis, or maybe wanted to expand out a bit. Luckily, most of these are playable on either the Switch Virtual Console, the Genesis Mini, or the excellent Sega Megadrive and Genesis collection on Steam. I really appreciate any and all support, and a like, subscribe, share, or comment can go a long way to making sure I can continue making content like this. I love talking about video games, and hope to keep making more of these. Thanks again, and happy gaming.